The lantern swung from Hugh Lockhart's outstretched hand, its amber flame cutting a small, warm circle in the absolute darkness of the New Mexico Canyon Trail. And when Jennie Wainwright reached for it, fingers trembling, lungs burning from the run, he pulled it back a single inch and pressed it into her palm with a finality that felt like a goodbye. "Keep walking," he said, and his voice carried no tremor, no uncertainty, only that low, granite steadiness that had undone her from the first moment she heard it. "I know these roads without it." She turned. She should not have turned. Every second of delay could mean death for both of them, because the men behind them were not the kind who missed twice, and they had already fired once into the darkness above her head. But she turned because she could not take another step away from Hugh Lockhart without looking at his face one final time, and what she saw there broke something open inside her that she had been guarding for months with every ounce of discipline she possessed. He was not looking at the dark. He was looking at her. "Hugh, go." The word was not unkind. It was the most careful thing she had ever heard a man say, wrapped in sacrifice and resolute love and the particular kind of grief that settles in the chest when a person makes a choice they know is right and know will cost them everything. "Take the lantern and go, Jennie. I will find you." She wanted to believe him. God help her. She wanted it the way starving people want bread, with a desperation that had nothing dignified or measured about it. But she had known Hugh Lockhart for 7 months now, and she knew what it meant when he said he would find her in a voice that calm. It meant he was not certain he would. She ran. Behind her, the lantern's circle of light vanished, swallowed by the dark canyon, and ahead of her stretched nothing but the unknown road and the thin orange flame she carried in her own 2 hands. And everything that had brought her to this moment began to unspool behind her feet like threads she could not stop losing. It had started, as so many dangerous things do, with a letter. Jennie Wainwright was 26 years old in the spring of 1882, and she had been surviving on the eastern fringes of respectability for as long as she could remember. She was not a woman who had been given much by way of inheritance or luck. Her father, a schoolteacher of modest skill and immodest drinking habits, had died of a fever outside Abilene when Jennie was 19, leaving her with a tattered copy of a Latin grammar, a talent for figures that nobody in her small Kansas town knew what to do with, and a fierce, stubborn intelligence that frequently made the men around her uncomfortable. She had spent 3 years keeping books for a dry goods merchant named Harold Pell, who paid her half what he would have paid a man for the same work, and reminded her of this fact often, as though she ought to be grateful for the insult. When the letter arrived from New Mexico Territory in the autumn of 1881, Jennie had been sitting at her narrow desk in the back room of Pell's store, adding a column of figures for the 4th time because the numbers would not come right, and she was beginning to suspect that Harold Pell was skimming from his own accounts and hoping she would not notice. The envelope bore a postmark from a town called Riordan Creek, which she had to find on a map before she understood where she was being invited. The letter was from a woman named Dorothea Crane, who had been a schoolgirl friend of Jennie's in the brief year the Wainwright family had lived in St. Louis. Dorothea had married a cattle rancher named Wallace Crane, moved west, and now found herself the postmistress and unofficial civic heart of a growing frontier settlement that desperately needed a schoolteacher. The town had 43 children between the ages of 5 and 15. The nearest schoolhouse was 30 miles away in the county seat. Dorothea was offering Jennie room and board and a salary that, while not extravagant, was nearly double what Harold Pell paid her. Jennie wrote back the same day and gave her notice to Harold Pell before she'd even received a response. She arrived in Riordan Creek on the 14th of March, 1882, by stage from Santa Fe, and the first thing she noticed was the sky. Coming from Kansas, she was no stranger to wide open space, but the New Mexico sky was a different creature entirely, vast and blue and absolutely relentless, pressing down on the red and ochre earth with an intimacy that felt almost aggressive, as though the heavens were trying to claim the land for their own. The mesas rose in the distance like dark sentinels, and the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to put out their first pale leaves, and the air smelled of sage and warming dust and possibility. The second thing she noticed was Hugh Lockhart. He was standing outside the stage depot with his hat pulled low and his arms folded, and at first she took him for a man who was waiting for someone else. He had the patient, economical stillness of a person who had learned long ago that hurry usually made things worse. He was tall, well above 6 feet, with the lean, angular build of a man who worked outdoors and did not carry a single unnecessary thing on his frame. His hair, what she could see of it beneath the hat brim, was dark with silver threaded through at the temples, which she found unexpectedly striking. He wore a Marshal's badge on his coat with the matter-of-fact air of someone who had forgotten it was there. He had not forgotten. She would learn later that Hugh Lockhart never forgot anything. Miss Wainwright. He stepped forward as the stage driver called her name, and when she turned to look at him directly, she found his eyes were a steady, light gray, the color of cloud cover just before rain, and they were regarding her with a careful, unhurried attention that was entirely different from the assessing, transactional looks she was accustomed to receiving from men who were deciding what category of woman she fell into. "Yes," she said, and waited. "Hugh Lockhart. I'm the town marshal. Dorothea Crane asked me to meet your stage. She's been held up at the post office. There was a disputed delivery and she couldn't leave." He paused. "She apologizes." "I'm sure I can find my own way," Jennie said, not unkindly, because she was already aware that the independent declaration was something of a reflex she could not always suppress. "I'm sure you could," he said, with equal lack of unkindness. "But Riordan Creek has 4 saloons and 3 alleys that aren't on any map, and it's easier to arrive at the Crane's house without walking through any of them if someone shows you the road." He picked up her trunk with the ease of someone lifting a hat box. "If you don't object." She did not object. She was not entirely sure why. Hugh Lockhart had not charmed her. He was not a man who dealt in charm, but there was something in his directness that she found disarming in a way she hadn't expected. He did not try to fill the silence between them with pleasantries or questions, and after a lifetime of men who used conversation as a way of establishing what they wanted from a woman, the silence felt oddly like respect. They walked 3 blocks through the main street of Riordan Creek, past the general store and the hotel and the livery, and Hugh pointed out each building with brief, factual identifications that told her everything useful and nothing decorative. He told her the name of the doctor, the nearest church, which saloon was quiet and which was not, and where the schoolhouse would be built. They were laying the foundation now, on a lot Dorothea Crane had donated at the east end of town. "Where is it now?" Jennie asked. "Where do the children have lessons?" "In the back room of the church on Monday through Wednesday. The Reverend has been teaching them himself, though he admits his Latin is insufficient." A pause. "He'll be relieved." "And you know his Latin is insufficient because he told me. He is not a man who hides his limitations." Something shifted at the corner of Hugh's mouth, not quite a smile but the territory adjacent to one. "He's unusual in that respect." Jennie thought about Harold Pell, who had hidden his limitations behind her labor for 3 years. "Most people are," she said. Hugh looked at her sideways, a brief and considering glance. "Yes," he said, "most are." Dorothea Crane was everything her letters had promised, warm and capable and possessed of a laugh that could fill a room without effort. She was 30 years old and had been in Riordan Creek for 6 years, and she knew the name of every person within 20 miles and their particular trouble and their particular strength. And she welcomed Jennie into her home with a matter-of-fact generosity that Jennie found immediately steadying. Wallace Crane was a tall, weather-darkened man of few words who had nonetheless built his wife a house with a proper parlor and a reading room, which told Jennie everything she needed to know about him. Hugh Lockhart set Jennie's trunk inside the front door, touched the brim of his hat to Dorothea, and left without ceremony. Jennie watched him go from the window and then told herself firmly to stop watching. She started teaching the following Monday, in the back room of the church, with 19 children on the first day and 23 by Friday, because word spread quickly in a small settlement that the new teacher did not talk down to her students or hit them with a ruler, and that she had taught even the most reluctant learners to read within a month in Kansas. The children ranged from the very young to a few teenagers who came with the particular wariness of people who have been told often enough that education was not for them. She loved it immediately and completely. And she saw Hugh Lockhart nearly every day, which was an entirely different kind of complication. In a town the size of Riordan Creek in 1882, the Marshal was not a distant figure of authority. He was present, visible, woven into the daily fabric of the place. She saw him in the mornings when she walked to the church, crossing the main street on some errand or another, and he would nod to her with a gravity that was not unfriendly. She saw him in the afternoons when she stayed late to review her students' work, and he sometimes passed the window, making his evening circuit of the buildings. She saw him on Sundays at the church service, where he sat in the back pew with his hat in his hands and listened to Reverend Mills with what appeared to be genuine attention. She noticed in those first weeks that Hugh Lockhart was extraordinarily good at his work in ways that were largely invisible. He headed off trouble before it became trouble. He knew, seemingly by instinct, which strangers coming through town were passing through and which were calculating their options, and he positioned himself accordingly. He spoke to men on the edge of violence with a quiet authority that drained the tension out of situations before most people had registered there was any. She watched him once, from the general store doorway, de-escalate a confrontation between two cattle hands and a local merchant over a disputed debt, and it was so smoothly accomplished that the three men walked away without understanding they had been managed. She asked Dorothea about him one evening in April, with what she hoped was a sufficiently casual tone. Dorothea saw through it completely and had the good grace not to acknowledge seeing through it. "Hugh came here about 4 years ago," she said, pouring coffee at the kitchen table while the spring wind rattled the shutters. "He was Marshal in a place called Cutter's Bluff before. Something happened there." She paused. "I don't know the whole of it, and I've never asked, because Hugh is the sort of man who will tell you what you need to know when he decides you need to know it." "Something bad," Jennie said. "Something that cost him." Dorothea set the coffee cup down and looked at Jennie with her frank, warm gaze. "He's a good man. There are not as many as there should be, and he is genuinely one. But he carries a weight he hasn't put down yet, and it makes him cautious in ways that can look like distance." Jennie thought about the gray eyes and the unhurried silence, and the way he had carried her trunk without making her feel diminished for needing it carried. "He doesn't seem distant," she said, and then caught herself. Dorothea smiled into her coffee. The dark past that Hugh Lockhart carried, Jennie would piece together gradually over the months that followed, the way you piece together a puzzle when someone only allows you to find one piece at a time. She did not press for information, partly out of genuine respect for his privacy and partly because she was aware in some deep and honest place that pressing Hugh Lockhart for anything he wasn't ready to give would be like pressing the canyon walls to move. It could not be done by force. It could only be done by waiting. What she learned in fragments. From the deputy, a cheerful young man named Tomas Rivera, who had grown up near Riordan Creek and treated Hugh with a combination of genuine admiration and careful protectiveness. From Dorothea, who knew more than she said but said what she judged Jennie needed. From Hugh himself, in those rare and careful moments when he offered her something direct. In Cutter's Bluff, 3 years before Riordan Creek, Hugh had been the marshal of a larger and more violent town. He had there built what he believed was a reliable network of informants and allies, men he trusted to give him the truth about the criminal operations moving through the territory. He had been wrong about one of them. A man he had trusted for 2 years, a man he had spoken up for when others had doubted, had been working both sides, feeding Hugh enough accurate information to maintain his confidence, while feeding the other side everything they needed to set a trap. 5 men had died in that trap. 3 of them were Hugh's deputies. The other 2 were townspeople caught in the crossfire of an ambush that should never have been possible if the intelligence hadn't been corrupted from inside. Hugh had survived. He had pursued the man responsible, a territory-level criminal operation run by a figure known as Cal Denner, to the edge of capture, and then legal complications and a bought judge had allowed Denner to slip free. Hugh had resigned his position in Cutter's Bluff rather than serve under the authority of a justice system so thoroughly compromised, and he had come to Riordan Creek, which was small and far from the worst of it, and tried to build something he could actually protect. Jennie understood, when she had gathered enough of this to see its shape, that the weight Dorothea had described was not guilt in the simple sense. It was more complicated than that. It was the particular burden of a person with an absolute internal commitment to loyalty who had been betrayed by his own faith in another person's loyalty. Hugh Lockhart had a core of absolute trustworthiness that was, in some ways, his most fundamental quality, and Cutter's Bluff had taught him, at great cost, that not every person he trusted deserved it. He had not stopped trusting, but he trusted carefully now, and slowly, and with his eyes fully open. She understood this because she had her own version of it. Harold Pell had not broken her faith in humanity, but he had installed a wariness in her that she sometimes resented, a tendency to wait for the moment when a person would reveal what they actually wanted from her, to withhold until she was certain. She and Hugh Lockhart were, in this way, 2 very careful people circling something they both wanted and were both afraid to name. The spring moved toward summer, and the schoolhouse walls went up, and Jennie moved her classes into the new building in May, where the light came through actual windows and the children had proper desks instead of borrowed church pews. She threw herself into the work with the intensity she brought to everything that mattered to her, and she began to understand her students not just as learners, but as individuals, their particular fears, their particular brightness, their particular circumstances. She fought for more books through Dorothea's contacts in Santa Fe. She organized a small lending library out of the schoolhouse on Saturday mornings. Hugh came to the lending library on the 3rd Saturday it was open. She had not expected him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the shelves she had built with Wallace Crane's help out of spare timber, and then he walked in and moved along the titles with the same careful attention he gave everything. He chose a volume of military history, one of the Grant memoirs that had come with a donation from the county seat, and brought it to the small desk where she sat. "I thought the library was for the children," he said, and his voice carried that almost smile. "It's for anyone in Riordan Creek who wants to read," she said. "I put it in the announcement." "I missed the announcement," he looked at her. "I'll bring it back next Saturday." "The record," she said, pushing a ledger toward him. "Name and title." He wrote his name in a clear, precise hand that surprised her for no good reason, and when he left she stared at the letters for a moment longer than was necessary. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. It became, through the accumulation of small and consistent acts, a thing between them that had no agreed name but a definite shape. Hugh walked her back to the Cranes' house on the evenings when she stayed late at the school, because Riordan Creek was growing, and the growth brought a rough element that he was monitoring carefully. He did not make this into a declaration or a formality. He simply fell into step beside her when she emerged from the building, and she simply let him, and they walked in the kind of silence that is only comfortable between people who have decided, at some level below speech, that they do not need to perform for each other. They talked when they talked, about real things. She told him about her father and the Latin grammar. He told her, one evening in June, about his mother, who had come west from Virginia, and had taught herself medicine from borrowed books because there was no doctor within 40 miles of where she settled. He talked about his mother with a fierce, quiet admiration that told Jennie everything about why he was capable of seeing a woman's intelligence as a thing to be respected rather than managed. She told him about Harold Pell. She had not told that story to many people, not the full version, not the part about how she had eventually discovered, definitively, that Pell was indeed embezzling from his own accounts and framing the discrepancies in ways designed to make it look like her error. She had left before it could be fully pinned on her, but the knowledge that someone had deliberately tried to use her as a scapegoat had left a residue she hadn't fully named before saying it aloud. Hugh listened without interrupting, which was the most valuable thing a person could do with that particular story. Then he said, "What happened to him?" "Nothing as far as I know." A pause. "That's not right." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. I'm sorry it happened to you." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, but there was something in the line of his jaw that told her the words cost him something, that they were not an automatic social formula but a genuine, considered offering. "Thank you," she said, and meant it entirely. She understood by July that she was in love with Hugh Lockhart. She understood it the way you understand something you have known for a while before you were willing to admit it, with a feeling of inevitability that was equal parts relief and terror. She was not a woman who fell easily or carelessly, and this was neither easy nor careless. It had built itself out of hundreds of moments, each one small and precise and real, and the cumulative structure of it was enormous, and she could not stop seeing it. She told Dorothea because she had to tell someone, and Dorothea received the information with a restraint that clearly cost her considerable effort. "Does he know?" Dorothea asked. "I don't see how he could," Jennie said. "I haven't said anything." Dorothea looked at her with fond exasperation. "Jennie, Hugh Lockhart is the most observant person I have ever met. He notices things the rest of us are not even aware are there to be noticed." Jennie thought about the gray eyes that missed nothing. "That's an uncomfortable observation." "Yes, I imagine it is." Dorothea smiled. "And you're going to have to figure out what to do with it, because I suspect he's been careful with you for the same reason you've been careful with him, and somebody is going to have to move first." The complication that moved first was not romantic. It was the hidden danger that had been building quietly at the edges of Riordan Creek for weeks, so carefully laid that even Hugh's trained attention had not yet fully caught its shape. His name was Cal Denner, the same Cal Denner whose criminal network had corrupted Hugh's informant in Cutter's Bluff, the same man whose bought judge had prevented his prosecution. He had apparently determined, in the intervening years, that the New Mexico territory offered significant opportunities in the form of land fraud, cattle theft, and the kind of systematic robbery that moved through territories like a slow disease, impossible to catch because it was everywhere at once. Jennie did not know this yet in July. She knew it in August, and the way she learned it was not gentle. She had a student named Emmett Crane, no relation to Wallace and Dorothea, a different family entirely, a boy of 12 who was one of the brightest students she had and who had been increasingly absent, which worried her. She went to his family's homestead, 3 miles outside town, to check on him, riding a borrowed mare that Dorothea kept for her use. And what she found was a family living under a particular kind of fear that she recognized, even then, as something she did not fully understand. Emmett's father, a man named Roy Crane, was a small cattle holder whose land sat at the junction of a water source and a valley route that was, it turned out, of significant strategic value to someone who wanted to control the movement of cattle through that part of the territory. He had been offered a price for the land that was below its value, had refused, and had since been subjected to a campaign of pressure that had escalated from offers to threats to the kind of implied violence that leaves no evidence. Jennie came home and told Hugh that evening. She had planned it as a simple factual account, but watching his face as she spoke was like watching a man who has been looking at a puzzle for weeks suddenly see the final pattern. He went very still in the particular way that, she now knew, preceded a period of intense invisible thinking. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. Roy said about 6 weeks, maybe more. "Did he tell you who made the original offer?" She had written down the name Roy gave her. She passed the paper to Hugh and he looked at it, and the stillness in him took on a different quality. "What is it?" she asked. He looked up at her, and she saw something in those gray eyes that she had not seen there before, not fear exactly, because she was not sure Hugh Lockhart was frightened by anything in the conventional sense, but a kind of careful alertness that told her the danger was significant and he was already calculating it. "That name is a front," he said. "A business name used by a network I've encountered before." He paused. "Cal Denner's network." And then he told her about Cutter's Bluff. The whole of it, not the fragments she had gathered from others. He told it cleanly and without self-pity, the way a person tells a thing they have decided the other person needs to know, and when he was done he looked at her steadily and waited. "He's here," she said, "or his operation is. His operation is. Whether he's here personally, I don't know yet. And Roy Crane's land is part of something larger." "I think so, yes." She thought about 12-year-old Emmett, who was frightened for his father and trying to pretend he was not, and who had been coming to school less because, when he was at school, he was not at home protecting a parent who should not have needed protecting. "What do we do?" Hugh looked at her steadily. "I need to know who in this territory is working with Denner. I need evidence before I can move legally, and I need to be careful not to alert them while I'm gathering it, because if they know I'm aware of them." He paused. "These are not cautious men when cornered." "The trap," she said, "like Cutter's Bluff." "The trap," he confirmed. "Yes." She did not say, "You cannot handle this alone." She knew him well enough by now to know he would not accept that framing, and also well enough to know it was true and that he was already aware of it. What she said instead was, "What can I do?" He looked at her for a long moment. She had the impression she was being assessed, not dismissively but seriously, the way he assessed everything that mattered. "Roy Crane trusts you," he said. "He's not going to talk to me because talking to the Marshal is exactly what the people threatening him have told him not to do, but he talked to you because you came for his son. You want me to be a go-between. I want you to be willing to if you're comfortable with it. I won't ask you to take a risk you don't want." "I'm comfortable with it," she said, which was perhaps not entirely true in the sense of comfortable, but was entirely true in the sense that she was going to do it regardless. Over the following 3 weeks, Jennie moved between the world she was seen to inhabit, the schoolteacher, the lending library, the regular rhythms of Riordan Creek, and the invisible work of carrying information. She visited Roy Crane twice more, ostensibly to discuss Emmett's education, and each time she came back to Hugh with what Roy had shared. She kept her ears open in the general store and the post office, where Dorothea, who had now been cautiously brought into the situation, processed information with the thoroughness of a woman who had been the community's nervous system for 6 years and knew how to listen without appearing to. She and Hugh developed a particular rhythm in those weeks that was, on the surface, simply the town marshal being thorough in his conversations with an observant schoolteacher. What it was in reality was something more like a partnership, close-grained and careful, and the closeness of it, the shared stakes, the mutual trust, the way they had each extended to the other a level of confidence that they did not extend easily, was doing things to both of them that had very little to do with Cal Denner. She noticed that Hugh had begun to look at her differently. Not the careful, considering assessment of their early acquaintance, but something more direct, something that he was making no great effort to conceal, though he was not yet doing anything about it. She caught it in the evenings when they walked, in the moments when their conversation paused, and neither of them moved to restart it, as though the silence had become a kind of conversation of its own. Dorothea noticed, too, with the uncanny precision of someone who had been watching both of them for months. "He's working up to something," she told Jennie one evening in late August, with such absolute confidence that Jennie did not bother to ask how she knew. "He's working up to figuring out whether Cal Denner has 3 or 4 active operations in this county," Jennie said. "He's working up to both things simultaneously," Dorothea said. "He is an efficient man." The crisis arrived, as crises in the Wild West often did, faster and with less warning than anyone had prepared for. It was a Thursday in the first week of September, and the day had been ordinary in all its visible dimensions. Jennie had taught a full morning of lessons, had stayed into the afternoon working on a letter to the county superintendent about additional funding for textbooks, and had walked out of the school into the late afternoon light to find Tomas Rivera waiting for her, and his face was not wearing its usual cheerful expression. "Hugh says you need to come to the Marshal's office," Tomas said quietly. "And he says take the alley behind the church, not the main street." Her stomach went cold in a way that was completely disconnected from the warmth of the September afternoon. "Why?" "He'll tell you. Just quickly, Miss Wainwright, please." Hugh was alone in the office when she arrived, and he had been doing something at his desk with a map spread out across it, and when she came in he rolled it and stood and looked at her with an expression that was absolutely controlled and told her, precisely because it was so absolutely controlled, that something had gone seriously wrong. "I've been compromised," he said. "Someone inside this territory's law structure, I don't know who yet, has tipped Denner's people that I'm building a case. I got word 20 minutes ago from a contact I trust. There are men coming to Riordan Creek tonight, not to negotiate." Jennie felt the room reorganize itself around her. "What does that mean for Roy Crane?" "Roy Crane and his family are already moving. Tomas went out an hour ago when I first got suspicious. They're at the Alvarez ranch tonight." He looked at her steadily. "What it means for you is that you are a person who has been seen meeting with Roy Crane multiple times and walking with me in the evenings, and Denner's people are not careful about who they use as leverage." She absorbed this. "You're telling me I'm in danger." "I'm telling you that until tonight is resolved, I cannot guarantee your safety if you stay in Riordan Creek. Then I leave." "Yes." "With you?" Something shifted in his expression, something restrained and real. "Not immediately. I need to be here tonight. I have Tomas and 2 men I trust, and we know they're coming, which is an advantage I am not going to surrender. But you need to be gone before dark." He moved to his desk and took out a hand-drawn map. "There's a route through the canyon south of town. It comes out at the Alvarez place. It's a 2-hour walk. You know the road into the canyon?" "Yes. You pointed it out to me when I first arrived." He looked at her for a moment. "I did." He said it like he was recalling the specific day, the specific moment, and finding something significant in the distance between then and now. "Take this map and go to the Crane's house first. Dorothea knows to have your travel things ready. She got my message an hour ago. Take the canyon road after that." He opened a cabinet and took out a lantern, which he set on the desk between them with the same deliberate care he brought to everything. "What about Jennie?" He said her name differently than usual. Not the careful, measured delivery of their early acquaintance, but something more direct, something that had nothing between it and the feeling underneath it. "I need you to go." "I know," she said. And then, because she had been careful long enough and the terror of the situation had burned away her reserve with the efficiency of a very sudden fire, "I need you to come back." He looked at her for 3 full seconds of silence, and in those seconds she watched something in him that had been held carefully, and at a distance decide it was done being held at a distance. "I will," he said. "I need you to believe that." "I do." She found she meant it completely, which was not the same as not being frightened. "I believe it." He walked her to the door and then outside, and at the edge of the main street where anyone could see them he paused, and then with the decisiveness of a man who has weighed something carefully and come to a resolution, he took her hand and held it for one moment, firmly and completely, and the warmth of it went through her like the first sun of a very long winter. 2 hours, he said. Canyon Road, Alvarez Ranch. She nodded and made herself walk. She was at the Crane's house within 5 minutes, where Dorothea had a packed bag waiting, and embraced her with a fierce, brief practicality that said everything without saying any of it. Wallace Crane, who knew the situation, pressed a folding knife into her hands without comment. She took the lantern she had left on the Crane's porch, the one Hugh had given her at the Marshal's office. She realized, because she had absently carried it out, and she stepped into the early evening light. And then it had happened exactly as it happened. She had been on the canyon road for perhaps 15 minutes, the lantern held before her in the gathering dark, when the sounds began behind her, not the specific sounds of men following her, not yet, but a disorder in the ordinary quiet of the evening that her body registered before her mind caught up. And then voices, and then the crack of a shot from somewhere behind in the town, and then the unmistakable sound of boots on gravel, not Tomas Rivera's cheerful jog but something heavier, more deliberate, and coming from the wrong direction entirely. She did not stop moving. She moved faster. Hugh appeared out of the dark ahead of her, from which direction, she could not have said, as though he had simply materialized on the road in front of her. And for one lurching, overwhelming moment she thought he had come for her, that something had changed and he had decided she could not go alone. But his expression told her differently. Something had happened in the town, not the planned confrontation which was running as intended, but something else, a second element that had come from an unexpected direction. "Go straight," he said, and his voice was low and rapid without any panic in it. "Straight on the canyon road. Don't take the fork, keep the creek to your right. 2 miles more and you'll see the Alvarez lights. What's happening behind you? A complication. It's handled, but there are 2 men on this road who took the canyon path thinking they could cut around my deputies." He paused. "I know where they are. I need to draw them away from you. Hugh, take the lantern." He lifted it from her hand where she had been carrying it at her side, and for a moment both their hands were on it, and his eyes were on hers, and everything that had been between them for 7 months was present in that moment in a way that neither of them had to name because both of them could feel it. Then he pressed it back into her palm, pressed it firmly, deliberately, like a promise, and said the words that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, the ones that broke her open and made her understand something about this man that could not be articulated but could only be known in the chest. "Keep walking. I know these roads without it." She turned away. She ran. The 2 miles to the Alvarez ranch were the longest of her life. The lantern lit the road 3 feet ahead of her feet, and she kept the sound of the creek to her right as instructed, and the canyon walls rose on either side of her in the dark like enormous patient things. And she did not look back because looking back was the one thing she was not permitted to do. Her mind, in the way that minds behave under extreme circumstances, did not remain helpfully blank. It was occupied with Hugh Lockhart, with the specific fact of him, with everything she knew about him and everything she had felt in the moment. He pressed that lantern into her hands. She thought about what Dorothea had said about him being a good man and carrying a weight he hadn't put down, and she thought about Cutter's Bluff and the 5 men who had died, and the way he had built something careful and real in Riordan Creek in the years since. And she thought about the hand holding her hand at the edge of the main street. And she thought, with absolute clarity, that if he did not come back to her, she would not recover from it. And she thought about this with a calm that was entirely new. Because the fear of loss had stopped being hypothetical, she reached the Alvarez ranch at something after 9 in the evening. The lights were in the windows and Roy Crane's wagon was in the yard, and Emmett came running out when he heard her footsteps on the gravel path, because he was 12 and frightened, and had been watching the darkness for the last 2 hours. Maria Alvarez, the rancher's wife, brought her inside with the immediate hospitality of the frontier, which operates on the understanding that you take people in first and ask questions when they have been fed. Jennie sat at the kitchen table and held the lantern in her lap like something she could not bring herself to put down, and she answered the questions she could answer, and she waited. 3 hours passed. She did not sleep, though Maria offered her a bed. Roy Crane sat up with her for part of it, a quiet solidarity, his own anxiety about the ranch and the threats and the future contained but present. Emmett eventually fell asleep on a folded blanket in the corner, his chest rising and falling with the complete physical trust of childhood sleep. The hoofbeats came at past midnight. She heard them from 50 yards out and was at the door before anyone else registered them, which told her something about the state of her nerve endings. Tomas Rivera came in first, and he was intact, and his expression was the particular relief of a person who has come through something successfully and knows it. Behind him on a second horse was a man she did not recognize, who had his hands bound behind him and the look of someone whose plans had not worked out. And then Hugh on his own horse, she could tell by his seat and the set of his shoulders before she could see his face, and he swung down from the saddle and handed the reins to Tomas without looking, because he was already looking at the porch. He was looking at her. She walked down the porch steps and stopped at the bottom one, because she did not entirely trust her legs. He came toward her across the yard in the moonlight, and she searched him quickly and clinically for injury, found none that were visible, and then stopped searching because he was close enough that she could see his expression, and his expression was something she had never seen on him before. It was the look of a man who has been keeping something under careful control for a very long time and has decided tonight to stop. "You kept walking," he said. "You told me to." "I did." He stopped an arm's length from her. Jennie, his voice was her name and everything that belonged to it all at once. "Are you hurt?" she asked, because she needed to know first. "No. What happened?" "I'll tell you all of it. In a moment." He looked at her with the absolute unhurried attention that was his most characteristic quality, and she realized he was doing what he always did. He was being completely sure before he committed. "I need to say something first." She waited. The moonlight and the distant sound of the creek and the warm light from the Alvarez kitchen windows made a frame around the moment that she would remember with perfect precision for decades. "I have been careful," he said, "because I made a serious mistake in trust once, and people I was responsible for died for it. I have been building this town carefully and doing my work carefully, and I have been careful about you specifically, because you are the most important thing in Riordan Creek to me, and that makes you the thing I am most afraid of losing, and I thought caution was the same thing as protection." She held herself very still. "Tonight I told you to take a lantern and walk alone into a dark canyon, and I handed you the only light we had between us and kept none for myself. And the reason I could do that, the only reason it was possible, is that I know every rock and turn of that road. I've walked it in daylight 100 times. I know it without light." He paused. "That's how I know you. I don't need to be careful anymore because I already know every part of what you are, and there is nothing in it that is anything other than everything I've been looking for, since before I knew I was looking." Jennie Wainwright, who was a woman of considerable composure and had kept that composure through 2 hours alone in a dark canyon and 3 hours of vigil in a stranger's kitchen, felt the composure dissolve completely and without apology. Her voice, when she found it, was steadier than she expected. "Hugh Lockhart," she said, "I have been in love with you since June, and it has been extraordinarily inconvenient." The corner of his mouth moved, and this time it went all the way, the full, rare, completely unguarded smile that she had seen the edges of for months and finally saw complete. "Since June," he said. "Possibly May." He reached out and took the lantern from her hands because she was still holding it and set it on the porch step beside them, and then took both her hands in his, and the warmth of that was the same as before but fuller, less held back. "I need to ask you something properly," he said. "Not tonight. Tonight I need to make a report to the county sheriff and see to the man we brought in and make sure Roy Crane's situation is fully documented and Hugh." "Yes." "I am not going anywhere." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "you're not." And something in the way he said it was not a statement of his intentions but a recognition of a fact that they had both been going somewhere separately for a long time, and they had arrived at the same place. The morning that followed was one of organized aftermath. Tomas Rivera had brought in 2 of Denner's men, and the third had been apprehended at the edge of town by the deputies Hugh had positioned, which had been the planned confrontation running as intended. The corrupted contact in the territory's law structure had been identified not by Hugh alone, but through the careful evidence building of the previous weeks, and he was a county land office employee whose manipulation of property records had been the mechanism for Denner's fraud. He was arrested by the county sheriff, who arrived from the county seat by mid-morning with 2 additional deputies, responding to Hugh's telegraphed alert of the previous afternoon. Cal Denner himself was not present in Riordan Creek. He was never a man who put himself in the path of consequence directly. But the arrest of his local network, combined with the evidence that Hugh had assembled carefully, methodically, with Jennie's help in the crucial weeks of August, was sufficient to trigger an investigation at the territorial level that would, over the following months, systematically dismantle the operation. Roy Crane's land was safe. The pressure campaign against him was documented, and the men responsible were held accountable. It was not, Hugh told Jennie with frank honesty, a complete or final resolution. Cal Denner would likely rebuild some version of his operation somewhere, eventually. The territorial justice system was better than it had been in the years of the Cutter's Bluff-bought judge, but not perfect. The work of the law in this territory was ongoing and imperfect and never simply done. But tonight, he said, on the evening after everything, when they were sitting on the front porch of the Cranes' house in Riordan Creek with coffee that Dorothea had made with the smug satisfaction of a woman whose predictions had come true, "Tonight is good. Tonight is very good," Jennie agreed. Dorothea, from inside the house, could be heard telling Wallace something in a tone of magnificent vindication. Hugh asked her properly, as he had said he would, on a Sunday in mid-September, in the way of a man who does things correctly once he has decided they should be done. He took her walking on the canyon road, the road she had run in terror 3 weeks before, which felt different now in daylight with him beside her, the creek singing on their right and the cottonwoods just beginning to turn golden at their edges with the first hints of the coming autumn. He said what he had to say without theater or elaborate ceremony, because Hugh Lockhart was not a theatrical man, but he said it with the completeness and directness that characterized everything he was, and when he finished, she had the particular sensation of a person who has been holding their breath for 7 months and has finally been allowed to breathe. She said yes with a conviction that came from the very foundation of her. They were married in November of 1882 in the church on the main street of Riordan Creek by Reverend Mills, whose Latin had indeed improved significantly since Jennie's arrival. Dorothea Crane was Jennie's witness, and Tomas Rivera was Hugh's, and the whole of the town attended because, in a settlement that size, there was no such thing as a small wedding, and because Hugh Lockhart was genuinely beloved in Riordan Creek in the quiet way of people whose competence and integrity had become things the community relied on, and because Jennie Wainwright had changed the prospects of 43 children and their families in 8 months, and the town understood its own debt to her. The ceremony was simple, and the celebration was not, because Dorothea organized the reception, and Dorothea had strong feelings about the appropriate scale of celebrations. There was music, a fiddle player from the livery and a man who played harmonica with surprising skill, and there was food that had been contributed by what seemed like every family in the vicinity, and there was dancing on the boards outside the church in the November evening, and Hugh Lockhart danced, which was something Jennie had not known about him, and which she found extraordinary in the best possible way. Because he danced the way he did everything with complete attention and no wasted motion, and the particular competence of someone who had learned things thoroughly once and did not lose them. She danced with him and thought about the lantern and the canyon road, and all the roads between the woman she had been in Harold Pell's back room in Kansas and the woman she was now, and she thought that the distance was much larger than the miles implied. The winter of 1882 into 1883 settled over Riordan Creek with the gentle severity of New Mexico winter's cold nights, brilliant days, a snow in December that was gone by afternoon. Jennie and Hugh set up their household in a house on the east side of town. Not far from the school, Hugh had purchased the lot the previous spring in what Jennie now understood was a quiet act of anticipatory faith. He had built the house with Wallace Crane and two other men over the summer, in the time he could spare from his duties, working on weekends and long evenings, and it had the same quality of solidity and careful attention that characterized everything he built. It had a proper kitchen and a good-sized parlor and a bedroom with windows facing east, so they caught the morning sun. She learned him in the way of domestic proximity, in all the small and specific details that are only available to the person who shares a life. He woke earlier than she did, and made coffee with a precision that suggested he had thought about the correct proportion of grounds to water, and settled it once and did not revisit it. He read seriously and in volume, history and law and the technical reports on territorial administration, but also, she discovered with delight, novels. He was working through Scott's Waverley novels in order, and had opinions about them that were unexpectedly vivid. He was economical with words in public and more generous at home, where the quiet confidence of their particular private world allowed him to say more of what he actually thought. He was, in the space of their shared life, completely trustworthy in the way she had come to understand trustworthiness, not as an abstraction but as a daily practice, a series of small and consistent acts that accumulated into a foundation. He did what he said he would do. He told her the truth about things that were difficult to tell. He listened to her, not in the performative, waiting for his turn way of many men she had known, but with genuine attention that registered and retained, and responded to what she actually said rather than what he expected her to say. She, in turn, learned to receive care without the reflexive wariness that had been her protection for so long. This was harder than it sounds. The habit of self-sufficiency, when it has been necessary for survival rather than preference, does not easily allow itself to be supplemented by another person's willing help. She caught herself, sometimes, running through the full calculation of a problem alone when she could have simply asked Hugh, and she caught herself being surprised when she did ask, and the answer came back useful and complete without conditions attached. The spring of 1883 brought several things of note. The territorial investigation into Denner's network, which Hugh followed in the detailed reports that came to him through official channels, resulted in 14 indictments across 3 counties. Cal Denner himself was named in the indictments but remained fugitive, had apparently departed the territory for somewhere further west or south, and there was a federal warrant issued that would follow him wherever he went. Hugh received this news with a measured satisfaction that did not pretend the matter was fully closed, but acknowledged that it was substantially advanced. Emmett Crane sat for an examination in April and placed at a level 2 years above his age, which Jennie reported to his parents with the particular pride of a teacher who has watched a student discover their own capability. Roy Crane, whose land was now definitively secured and whose relationship with the future had substantially improved, built an addition to his house in gratitude and named it, with a frontier directness that Jennie found touching, the library room. He had become one of the lending library's most consistent borrowers. And in April, Jennie told Hugh that she was expecting a child. He received this information in the way he received important things, with absolute stillness and attention and no superfluity of reaction. He set down the book he had been reading and looked at her with the kind of direct, undefended expression she had learned to recognize as his version of deep feeling. Then he stood and came to where she was sitting and held her face in both his hands and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "Are you well?" he asked. "How do you feel?" "Perfectly well," she said. "I asked the doctor this morning. He says everything is as it should be. You went to the doctor without telling me first. I wanted to be certain before I told you." He looked at her. "You could have told me uncertain." She thought about this. "Yes," she said, "I could have old habits." "Old habits," he agreed, but without reproach. He was not a man who created reproach from the small frictions of intimacy. He kissed her forehead with the careful tenderness that was entirely his own, not demonstrative in the public sense but complete and unhesitating in private, and then said, We'll need to write to Dorothea. She'll be insufferable, Jennie said. Yes. She's going to enjoy being right about us for the rest of our lives. She is going to enjoy being right about us for the rest of her life, Jennie corrected. Our lives are a different matter. We are simply going to have to live excellently to give her adequate material. He smiled at her, the complete smile, the rare and full one. That sounds manageable. The summer moved through the heat of July and August with the particular quality of a life in which important things are both happening and being properly tended. Jennie continued teaching until late into her pregnancy, because she would not leave her students without adequate notice, and because the school board, which was new and somewhat uncertain of its authority, had suggested, tentatively, that perhaps she might wish to step back sooner, and she had explained to them, without anger but with considerable precision, why she would not. Hugh, when the school board mentioned their concern to him in a social context, responded with a brevity that managed to convey both respect for their position and his own clear opinion on the matter, and the school board did not raise the subject again. A substitute teacher was arranged from Santa Fe for the autumn term, a young woman named Clara Betts, whom Jennie met and approved thoroughly and spent 3 weeks briefing with the comprehensive thoroughness of someone handing over something they cared about deeply. Jennie's mother had died when Jennie was 12, which meant she approached the prospect of childbirth with a mixture of anticipation and a deeply private fear that she named to Hugh one August evening on the porch, because naming things to Hugh had become, over the months of their marriage, both habit and healing. He listened with the total attention that was his gift. He did not offer false reassurance. What he said after a moment was, "Dr. Bellows has practiced frontier medicine for 22 years and he is competent. Dorothea will be here." He paused. "And so will I, as near as they'll let me." "They may not let you very near at all," she said. "I'm aware of that. I'll be near as they'll let me." Another pause. "You are strong, Jennie. I have watched you be strong in circumstances that would have undone most people. That is not a reason to dismiss your fear. But it is a reason why I am not afraid for you." She thought about this for a while. "That actually helps," she said. "Good." Their son was born in late October of 1883, and his name was James, after Hugh's father, with Jennie's father's name Edward, for a middle name, which Hugh had suggested without prompting, and which had made her cry in the particular way of someone who has been surprised by the exact right thing. James Edward Lockhart arrived in the world with a decisiveness that the doctor described as unusual and Jennie described as entirely appropriate given who his father was. He was healthy and substantial and deeply unimpressed with his new circumstances, expressing this displeasure with a vigor that Hugh observed from the doorway, having been allowed in precisely, as Jennie had predicted, near as they'd let him, with an expression of such unguarded wonder that she laughed through her exhaustion and her joy. He held James with the same careful steadiness he brought to everything that mattered, securely, competently, without drama, and James, as though recognizing the quality of the attention, stopped crying. "He knows," Jennie said. "Knows what?" "That you're someone who can be trusted." Hugh looked at her over the top of their son's head with gray eyes that were entirely undefended, and she felt, in that moment, the full weight of the life they had built together, and the improbability and the absoluteness of it. Riordan Creek grew through 1884 and into 1885 with the organized energy of a frontier settlement finding its mature shape. The schoolhouse was expanded, and Jennie returned to teaching in the spring of 1884, with James spending his mornings in the care of Maria Alvarez, who had become both friend and ally in the practical negotiations of working motherhood, and who took to the arrangement with a warmth that made the arrangement feel like community rather than transaction. Hugh was appointed to a regional marshal position in 1884, which extended his jurisdiction to 3 counties and brought with it both additional resources and additional complexity. He handled the expansion with the same systematic thoroughness that characterized his approach to everything, building a deputy network across the extended territory with a care that was informed, always, by what had happened in Cutter's Bluff. He chose his people slowly and verified them across multiple dimensions before trusting them with anything sensitive. Tomas Rivera was promoted to Chief Deputy of Riordan Creek, a role he grew into with a competence that made Hugh quietly proud. Cal Denner was apprehended in the spring of 1885 by federal marshals in Arizona Territory, where he had attempted to establish a new version of his land fraud operation, and had found that the federal warrant that followed him had preceded his arrival. Hugh received the telegram reporting the arrest on a Wednesday morning and read it twice and then folded it and put it in his desk drawer. And when Jennie asked him that evening what had happened, because she could read the particular quality of his stillness by now with absolute accuracy, he told her. She watched him for a moment. "How does it feel?" He considered the question seriously. "Like something that has been unfinished for a long time is finished," he said. He paused. "Not the men in Cutter's Bluff. That doesn't become different, but the specific thing I could do something about, that's done." "Yes," she said. And then, because she knew him completely, "You did something about it." He looked at her. "We did." She thought about August 1882 and Roy Crane's kitchen and the walks to the Alvarez Ranch, and the information passed in careful fragments across the ordinary surfaces of daily life, and she thought he was right. "We did," she agreed. The weight Dorothea had described in those first weeks, the one he carried from Cutter's Bluff, she had watched him put down, piece by piece, over the 3 years of their marriage. Not forget. Hugh Lockhart would not forget the 3 deputies who had died in that ambush. She had met their names in his conversation enough times to know they were present and honored. But the active burden of unfulfished justice, of a wrong that had found no accounting, that was resolved, and she could see the difference in him, a quality of completion that was not the same as softness but was related to peace. James, at 2 years old, was acquiring language at a rate that Jennie found professionally satisfying and practically exhausting, because he had inherited his mother's capacity for intense focus and his father's patience, and used both of them to ask questions about the world in unrelenting succession from the moment he woke until the moment he slept. Hugh answered every question with the same serious attention he brought to adults, which James responded to by asking more questions. Jennie found this dynamic, which played out at the breakfast table with particular intensity, absolutely delightful in the way that things are delightful when they are both charming and someone else's problem for the next 20 minutes. In the summer of 1885, a situation arose that tested, briefly but significantly, the shape of the life they had built. A family arrived in Riordan Creek, a father, mother, and 4 children, from a settlement in Texas that had been part of a disputed land claim. The father, a Mexican-American man named Vincent Morales, had a legitimate title to land that a local power structure in his previous location had chosen not to recognize, and the intimidation and legal maneuvering used against him bore a pattern that Hugh recognized immediately from his documented experience with similar operations. Hugh took the case on without anyone asking him to. He spent 6 weeks corresponding with legal contacts in Texas, gathering documentation, and writing formal complaints to the Federal Land Office. It was not within his specific jurisdiction, but he had regional connections now and a reputation that carried weight, and he used both. The Morales family's land claim was eventually upheld through the federal process. Not immediately, not without difficulty, but finally and completely, and Vincent Morales, who had been reserved and watchful through the whole proceeding in the way of a man who has been failed by institutions enough times to find hope expensive, shook Hugh's hand at the resolution and said something in Spanish that Tomas Rivera, who was present, translated quietly. He says, "A man who uses his authority for its purpose is rarer than gold." Hugh accepted this with a nod, and later that evening at home, told Jennie about it with a thoughtfulness that told her it had mattered to him. "He's not wrong that it's rare," he said. "It shouldn't be rare." "No," she agreed. "It shouldn't. That's what I want this office to be, not rare, standard." She looked at him across the kitchen table where their son was asleep in the back room and the autumn wind was beginning to work at the edges of the shutters, and she felt the particular love that is not the hot, astonished love of new beginnings but the deep and rooted love of people who have chosen each other repeatedly across every kind of circumstance. "It is what this office is," she said. "In this territory under this Marshal, you're setting a standard." He looked at her. "You're the one setting standards," he said. "You've turned out more readers and mathematicians from this county in 3 years than the county seat has managed in 10. I've heard the superintendent say so." He said competent instruction is evident, she said. It was effusive for him. The almost smile appeared and then the full smile. It was. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1886 on an April morning when the cottonwoods were putting out their first leaves again, and they named her Frances, which had been Hugh's mother's name. She was smaller than James had been and possessed, from her earliest days, of a quality of watchful intelligence that reminded Jennie of Hugh's gray eyes turned to a purpose, noting everything. Hugh, who had received James's arrival with wonder, received Frances with a tenderness so complete that Jennie had to look away for a moment because watching it was almost more than she could hold. James, who was 2.5, approached his sister's arrival with a serious and proprietary concern that suggested he had decided his primary responsibility in life was to make sure she was all right. This quality did not diminish as they grew. It was simply part of who he was. Dorothea Crane, who attended the birth as she had attended James's, held Frances in the first hour of her life and said, to nobody in particular, "Well, this family is entirely unfair in what it produces," and then laughed at her own sentiment and handed the baby back to Hugh, who received her with the same careful steadiness he had given James and which Frances, just as James had, immediately recognized as trustworthy. The years of the late 1880s settled into the deep particular rhythm of a life fully occupied. Jennie continued teaching, and the school continued to grow as Riordan Creek grew, and she hired a second teacher in 1887, a young woman from the county seat named Helena Ross, who was enthusiastic and capable, and who absorbed Jennie's methods with the eager intelligence of someone who had found a model for the kind of teacher she wanted to be. Jennie mentored her with the same generosity that had characterized her best teachers, and Helena became, over time, a genuine colleague and friend. Hugh's regional role expanded again in 1887, when the territorial authorities recognized that his approach to law enforcement, systematic, evidence-based, attentive to civil rights in ways that were not universal among frontier lawmen, was producing results that justified broader application. He now supervised a marshal circuit that covered a significant portion of the territory, traveling regularly but always returning. He was the kind of man who went away and came back, and the coming back was as reliable as the going, and Jennie had learned over the years to hold both, the anxiety of the going and the certainty of the return as a single truth. She published in 1888 a short monograph on methods of teaching reading to non-English-speaking students in frontier settlements, which emerged from her work with the children of Mexican and Hispanic families in Riordan Creek's growing population. She wrote it in evenings and on Sundays over a period of months, at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and Hugh read every draft with the serious attention. He gave everything she made and offered observations that were precise and useful, without ever exceeding his actual knowledge of education into territory that was hers alone. The monograph was published by a small educational press in Santa Fe and was read, she would later learn, in classrooms across the territory and beyond. On the evening she received the first printed copies, she came home from the post office and set one on the kitchen table, and Hugh picked it up and read the title page and then looked at her with an expression that was simply, completely pride. Jennie Lockhart, he said, reading the author's name. It has to say Wainwright professionally, she told him. My students know me as Miss Wainwright. It's the name they associate with education. Jennie Wainwright, he said, correcting himself without difficulty. This is an accomplishment of considerable significance. It's a pamphlet. It is a contribution to the education of children across this territory. It is significant. He set it down and looked at her. I am proud of you. She had heard those words before, from Dorothea, from Reverend Mills, from the county superintendent with his grudging effusiveness. They did not affect her the same way from those sources as they did from Hugh Lockhart. She was not entirely certain why, except that it had something to do with the fact that Hugh's opinion was not offered lightly and therefore carried specific weight, and that he had known her from before she was certain she could do this thing and had always been certain on her behalf. I'm proud of you too, she said. I've been meaning to say it more. He raised an eyebrow, the slight, precise lift that was his version of surprise. For what? For everything, she said. All of it. The work and the way you do it and who you are. He looked at her for a moment in the evening quiet of the kitchen, with the children asleep in the back of the house and the lamp burning between them on the table. We built this together, he said. We did, she agreed, and they had. The whole of it, the town that was safer and more literate and more just than it had been. The two children who were growing into themselves with the particular confidence of people who have been fully seen and consistently loved. The house on the east side of town, where the morning sun came in through the bedroom windows. The partnership of work and thought, and the private, complete intimacy of two very careful people who had chosen each other without reservation. The lantern that Hugh had pressed into her hands on the canyon road in September of 1882 sat on the shelf in the parlor. It was no longer in regular use. They had better lamps now, and Hugh had replaced it twice over for the office, but she had kept it specifically, set it on the shelf specifically, and when he noticed it one evening in their first winter and looked at her with a question, she said simply, "It stays." He looked at the lantern for a moment. "Yes," he said, "all right." It was there through the births of both children and through Cal Denner's arrest, and through the publication of the monograph, and through every year that followed, on its shelf in the parlor of the Lockhart house, an object that meant, to both of them, everything that had been spoken and unspoken in the darkness of the canyon road. The trust given in a single gesture, the love declared through the act of surrender, the absolute faith that she could carry the light and he could walk without it because he knew the road. In 1890, James Lockhart turned 7 and began attending his mother's school, which produced in him a complicated mix of pride and the specific social anxiety of a child who must navigate being the teacher's son with a classroom full of peers. He managed this with a combination of Hugh's steadiness and Jennie's directness that suggested the combination would serve him well his entire life. Frances at 4 was already reading, had taught herself, largely, from the books that filled the parlor shelves, and regarded this as simply what one did when one was surrounded by words, which was entirely reasonable given the household. Riordan Creek in 1890 was a settled town of nearly 800 people, with 2 schools and a proper courthouse and a bank, and a newspaper that had been publishing weekly for 3 years. The frontier wildness that had characterized it in 1882, the rough edges, the 4 saloons, the periodic violence of men moving through territory that was still being negotiated between civilization and its absence, had not vanished but had been substantially contained, and the containment was not accidental. It was the result of years of work by people who had decided this was going to be a place, a real one, and had built accordingly. Hugh Lockhart, standing in front of the courthouse in the October light of 1890, was a different figure than the man who had met Jennie's stage in 1882, in the ways that years of good living and completed work change a person. He was 43 now, the silver in his hair more prominent than the dark, and he carried his authority with the unobtrusive confidence of someone who has long since stopped needing to assert it. The town knew him. The territory knew him. And in the specific way that mattered most, one particular woman knew him, all the way through, in the complete and unreserved way that is only possible between two people who have decided to see each other fully and have found what they see worth seeing. Jennie came out of the school on that October afternoon and found him there, which was unusual. He typically finished his circuit earlier in the day. He was watching the street with the particular attention she associated with general observation rather than specific vigilance, and when she came to stand beside him, he turned and looked at her with the steady, clear regard she had been receiving for 8 years and still found as disarming as the first time. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "What we built," he said. She followed his gaze, the street, the courthouse, the school behind her, the people moving through the afternoon. "What we helped build," she amended. "Yes." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the October sun warm on their faces, the sounds of the town, a steady, ordinary music around them. "Frances read a full page of the primer this morning," Jennie said. Unprompted, she simply sat down and read it. Hugh took this in with appropriate gravity. "She's 4. I am aware she is 4. I am the one who has been teaching reading for 8 years. We are going to have an extraordinarily difficult time keeping up with her. I expect so, yes." He looked at her. The almost smile appeared. "I find I don't mind." She thought about all the things she had minded, over the years and before the years. The things that had been hard, and the things that had required reckoning, and the things that had cost her something real. She thought about the canyon road and the lantern and the particular quality of the darkness on that night in September 1882, and she thought about what it had felt like to emerge from the canyon into the lamplit Alvarez yard with Hugh's voice still in her ears, telling her to keep walking, that he knew the road. He had known the road. He knew all the roads. That was the thing about Hugh Lockhart that was both the hardest and the most valuable, that he did not pretend certainty he lacked, but the certainty he did carry was absolute, and it was never misplaced. "I don't mind either," she said. He took her hand in the way he had taken it on the main street before the canyon road, firmly and completely, without ceremony or hesitation, as a fact. The afternoon light made long shadows from the courthouse steps, and somewhere in the school behind them, their son was finishing a lesson, and their daughter was with Maria Alvarez, who still, 8 years on, took Frances for the afternoons with the steady warmth of chosen family, and the town moved around them in its ordinary, constructed, hard-won life. She thought, not for the first time, about the letter from Dorothea that had brought her here. About Harold Pell's back room in Kansas, and the Latin grammar and the stage to Santa Fe, and the man who had met her stage with her trunk, and the Marshal's badge worn with the matter-of-fact air of someone who had forgotten it was there. About how none of the things she had now were things she had planned or predicted or reached for with anything so deliberate as intention. They had emerged from the accumulation of small true choices, from saying yes to a letter and yes to a canyon road, and yes to a man who pressed a lantern into her hands and told her to keep walking. She had kept walking. She always had. And he had found her, as he had said he would, at every necessary point, without fail and without condition, and without asking for anything in return except the same constancy she freely gave. The afternoon settled around them, golden and complete, and Jennie Wainwright Lockhart stood in the October sun of Riordan Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the year 1890, with her husband's hand in hers and the school behind her, and the whole built life spreading in every direction from this single standing point, and felt, with the clear-eyed certainty that had always been her most honest quality, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. There were more years ahead, more seasons of the particular work they had each chosen, more growth in the children who were only at the beginning of becoming who they would be, more of the ordinary, extraordinary days that make up a life well lived. There would be more challenges, because the world does not stop presenting them, and more moments that required the courage that is not the dramatic courage of canyon roads, but the daily courage of showing up fully and staying. There would be more Sunday mornings in the church where Hugh still sat in the back pew, and more Saturday lending library hours that he still attended with a different book each time, and more evenings on the porch when the wind was right and the day was done, and there was nothing required of either of them except to be present in the same place at the same time. The lantern would stay on its shelf. The road would continue to be known. And Jennie Wainwright and Hugh Lockhart, who had each been careful for so long and had finally, completely, chosen not to be, who had given and received the particular trust of two people who have walked separately through darkness and found in each other both the light to carry and the knowledge of the road beneath, would walk all of it together, every step, the whole way through.